The snow began falling somewhere around midnight, softly at first, the way lies always begin, gently, almost beautiful, disguising everything terrible that follows. Elena Vance did not notice it until she stepped out of the Lyric Opera House's stage door, violin case strapped across her back, her breath forming small ghosts in the bitter Chicago air. She had played Sibelius tonight, the violin concerto in D minor, 47 minutes of music that had required 2 years of her life, a stress fracture in her left wrist, and the kind of emotional excavation that left you hollow and trembling long after the final bow. Tonight, the audience had risen to their feet. She had stood at the edge of the stage under those blazing lights and felt the applause like a physical thing, warm and roaring, pressing against her sternum, and she had thought, This is the only thing that matters. Her bow hand had shaken. She hoped no one saw. Now the applause was gone, replaced by the hiss of wind through the canyon corridors of Michigan Avenue, and the snow was no longer gentle. It came sideways, whipped by a lake wind that carried the particular cruelty of Chicago winters, the kind that found the gaps in your coat and lodged itself there like a grudge. She found her car in the underground parking structure, a silver Audi, 3 years old, her most expensive possession besides the Guarneri violin her late professor had left her in his will. She set the case carefully on the passenger seat, the way a mother might set down a sleeping infant, and started the engine. The heater groaned to life. She pressed her palms against the vents, waiting for warmth that was slow to come. Her phone showed 43 text messages. Her manager, her mother in Portland, 3 journalists who had somehow gotten her number, a student she'd been meaning to call back for weeks. She silenced the screen and set it face down on the console. She just wanted to get home. The drive from the theater to her apartment in Lincoln Park typically took 20 minutes. Tonight, with visibility dropping to near zero and the plows nowhere to be found, it would take longer. She navigated the underground exit slowly, emerging onto the white smothered street, tires finding uncertain purchase on the newly packed snow. The city's usual chaos, the horns, the bodies, the relentless commercial energy, had been muted. Chicago under a blizzard was something close to peaceful, if you didn't think too hard about what was hiding in all that white. She was crossing under the L tracks at Wabash when she first saw it in her rearview mirror. A black SUV. Large, American-made from the look of it, sitting perhaps 4 car lengths behind her. She wouldn't have registered it at all. Black SUVs were as common as pigeons in this city, except that she had been watching it, distantly, since she'd turned off Michigan Avenue. It had matched every turn, left on Wacker, right on State, now south on Wabash. Coincidence, she told herself. She turned right on Randolph, headed west. The SUV turned right on Randolph. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel. She was a musician, not a paranoid person. She had no enemies, no feuds, no complicated entanglements. She taught violin lessons on Tuesday afternoons to the children of Lincoln Park attorneys, and she ate Thai food alone on Friday nights. And the most dangerous thing she had done in recent memory was jaywalk outside Whole Foods. There was no reason for anyone to follow her. She turned left on Halsted. The SUV turned left on Halsted. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. Don't panic. She kept her breathing even, the way her therapist had taught her. 4 counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts out. And deliberately turned south onto a street she didn't need, watching the mirror. The SUV followed. No headlights on. She realized this only now. The vehicle had been driving without headlights for blocks, in a blizzard, at midnight. She pressed the accelerator. The Audi responded, fishtailing slightly on a patch of ice before the all-wheel drive corrected. She was moving too fast for these conditions, she knew it, her knuckles white on the wheel as she pushed south through the white blind streets, taking turns too quickly, the back end sliding on each curve. 30 miles per hour. 40. The SUV kept pace easily. It was larger, heavier, and whoever was driving it knew these streets. She thought about calling 911. Her phone was face down on the console. She reached for it, and the car hit a ridge of packed snow and lurched sideways, and she yanked the wheel back and abandoned the phone. The lakefront was ahead. She could see the ambient glow of the harbor lights bleeding through the snow curtain, orange and diffuse, and she knew she had gone too far south and east, had driven herself toward the industrial waterfront instead of the residential neighborhoods where there would be lit windows and open diners and human beings who could help her. She pumped the brakes. Nothing happened. She pumped them again, harder, standing on the pedal with her full weight, and felt only the terrifying absence of resistance, the pedal going straight to the floor with no mechanical response whatsoever, and the car was still accelerating down the slight grade toward the harbor, 50 miles per hour now, the guardrail appearing out of the blizzard ahead of her like a suggestion. No, 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 no. She wrenched the handbrake. The rear wheels locked. The car spun, a full 180, and then the guardrail was gone, and there was a half-second of terrible emptiness, and then the black water of Lake Michigan swallowed the car whole. The cold was incomprehensible. Not like cold she had experienced before, not winter cold, not cold shower cold, but something physiological and absolute, a full-body shutdown that her nervous system simply could not process. The water rushed in through the crumpling door seals immediately, black and shockingly fast, rising over her ankles, her shins, her thighs. She screamed, and water went into her mouth, and she gagged and screamed again. The violin. She thought absurdly of the violin. She reached for the seatbelt clasp with fingers that were already losing dexterity, the cold having traveled from her skin inward with extraordinary speed, and the clasp was jammed. Impact damage, she realized, from the crash through the guardrail. And she was pulling at it, both hands. But her hands were not working properly anymore, and the water was at her chest now, and the car was sinking nose first, tilting her forward, so that the black water pressed against the windshield and began to crack it. She was going to die. The thought arrived without drama, a simple, factual acknowledgement. I am going to die in this car, at 27 years old, in Lake Michigan, in a blizzard, because someone cut my brake lines. Even in that extremity, the musician in her noted the detail. Someone cut my brake lines, and filed it away with the precision of a person who spent her life attending to what others missed. The windshield cracked. Water sheeted in. She was still pulling at the seatbelt. Her vision had begun to narrow, the edges going gray-black, hypothermia arriving with terrible efficiency. She was aware of the cold as a kind of music now, a low, relentless drone, E-flat below the bass clef, the note that never resolved. Through the failing edges of her vision, she saw, impossibly, a dark shape outside the window, a figure in the water, moving with deliberate purpose, not panicking, not struggling, moving through the black lake as though it were a room he had crossed 1,000 times. Something in her hand. A tool, she would not know until later what kind. And then the car window simply ceased to exist, and the water pressure equalized, and hands, large, strong, insistent, found the seatbelt clasp, and there was a knife. And then she was free, and she was moving upward, being carried upward, and she could not help it all. Her body entirely surrendered to the cold, to the darkness, to the man pulling her through black water toward the distant orange suggestion of the shore lights. She did not remember the surface. She did not remember being carried. She woke on the concrete of the harbor walk, on her side, with her cheek against the snow, and someone's wool scarf wrapped around her neck and chest, still wet, but providing some windbreak. An ambulance siren was approaching from somewhere to the north. Her lungs ached. Her hands and feet were entirely numb. She looked around. She was alone. Only the scarf. And there, 3 feet from her face, resting in a small, clear space where the snow had been disturbed by someone kneeling, a gold lighter. Classic design, the rectangular shape of old American Zippos. Engraved on its face, she could see even through her blurred vision, was an emblem. A hawk in flight, wings spread, stylized with the precision of something that had been designed with intention and pride. Seahawk. She did not know what it meant. She tucked the lighter into her coat pocket with fingers she could barely feel, because it was the only evidence that any of this had been real, that someone had been here, had saved her, had been real enough to leave something behind. Then the ambulance arrived, and the paramedics were around her, and she let the noise and the lights and the warmth take her under. The hospital room was the color of denial. Off-white walls, fluorescent light that stripped the humanity from everything it touched. A television bolted to the ceiling, playing a weather forecast on mute. Outside the window, the blizzard had settled into a steady, patient snowfall, the kind that would continue for hours, burying the city incrementally, reclaiming whatever it wanted. Elena had been in the room for 6 hours before Detective Marlowe arrived. She had spent those hours being warmed, assessed, treated for early-stage hypothermia and a 3-inch laceration on her right forearm, from the shattered car window, she assumed, and answering the preliminary questions of 2 uniformed officers who wrote down everything she said with the careful, skeptical courtesy of people who had heard too many unusual stories to be fully credulous about any of them. She had not mentioned the man who saved her. Not yet. She wasn't sure why. Something protective, perhaps, or something else she didn't examine too closely. Detective Marlowe was a compact woman in her late 40s, with a gray-streaked bun and the kind of face that had decided some time ago to stop performing warmth it didn't feel. She sat in the chair beside Elena's bed and set a paper cup of coffee on the side table without offering it, pulled out a notebook that still had real paper in it, and looked at Elena with eyes the color of winter harbor water. "Ms. Vance, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to understand that your answer is going to determine the direction of the next several weeks of my life. So take your time." She set her pen against the paper. "Do you have any idea who might want you dead?" The word, dead, landed with a weight that Elena hadn't assigned to the previous night. She had thought, accident, mechanical failure, terrible coincidence. The uniformed officers had not said anything to disrupt this. Marlowe, apparently, felt no similar restraint. "I'm sorry," Elena said. "Your brake lines." Marlowe placed a photograph on the bed. Specifically, the hydraulic line to both front calipers, cut cleanly, with something narrow. Needle-nose pliers is our preliminary assessment, or specialized wire cutters. Not frayed from use, not corroded through. Cut. She let that sit in the air between them. Whoever did this knew what they were doing and had access to your vehicle. We're pulling the parking structure footage from the theater now. Elena looked at the photograph, close up, industrial lighting on a severed line, and felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, exactly. Something more structural than that. A sudden awareness that the floor she'd been standing on was not, in fact, solid. "No," she said. "I can't think of anyone." "Any unusual interactions recently? Threats, unwanted attention? Anyone who felt wrong to you?" She thought. The performance had been sold out. The backstage area had been full of the usual traffic. Stagehands, other musicians, the conductor's assistant, a photographer from the Tribune, sponsors who wanted to shake hands and have their photographs taken with the talent. There had been the VIP reception in the East Wing, the kind of gathering Elena had learned to navigate, with a glass of sparkling water in her hand and a smile calibrated to polite disengagement. The city's wealthy and consequential, wanting proximity to beauty they couldn't themselves produce. And then she remembered something. She had slipped away from the reception early, taking a back corridor to the green room to practice the second movement's transition she'd felt slip during the performance. She was always doing this, always finding some inadequacy to work on while others were celebrating. The green room corridor ran adjacent to a private hospitality suite. She had her phone out, already recording herself, habit of years, when she'd heard the voices through the partially open door. Russian. She understood Russian. Her grandmother on her mother's side had insisted on it. a point of identity Elena had resented learning and was eternally grateful for. Two men discussing a schedule, a shipment. Tiagela Voruzhenie, heavy armaments. Docks, a date, a contact name she hadn't caught fully. She had kept walking, recording, thinking almost nothing of it. People talked about things she didn't understand all the time, and her mind had been mostly still occupied with the Sibelius, and she'd practiced her transition in the green room for 8 minutes, and gone back to the reception and had another sparkling water and shaken more hands and then driven into a blizzard and nearly died. She looked at Detective Marlowe. "I may have recorded something," she said slowly, "by accident." The silence that followed was the specific kind that contains a great deal of movement. Marlowe leaned forward. "I'm going to need you to explain that very carefully." Elena explained it. While she explained it, she watched Marlowe's expression, which was the expression of someone who had been in a moderately interesting situation and had just understood that it was an extremely interesting situation. By the time Elena had described the content of the recording, the Russian, the words she was certain of, the date she'd heard mentioned, next week, Marlowe had set down her pen and was looking at her phone. "I'm going to have to make a call," Marlowe said. "Before I do that, I'm going to ask you not to share this information with anyone. Not your manager, not your family, not your friends. Specifically, not on any electronic device. Do you understand why I'm telling you that?" "Because whoever cut my brake lines doesn't know what I heard," Elena said. "They just know I was there." Marlowe looked at her with something approaching respect. "Play me that recording." Elena reached for her phone on the side table, the phone she had left face down on the car console. She did not, until this moment, understand how she had it. She checked. It was hers. Slightly water damaged at the charging port, but functional. The recording was there, time-stamped 10:47 p.m., 4 minutes and 20 seconds long. She played it. Marlowe listened with absolute stillness, the way people listen to things that matter. "I need to take this," Marlowe said, reaching for the phone. "I need it back. I'll copy the file. Give me 20 minutes. She stood, then stopped, something occurring to her. "Ms. Vance, the person who pulled you out of the lake. The officer's report says you were alone when the paramedics arrived." Elena had forgotten she hadn't mentioned him. Or perhaps she hadn't forgotten. "The scarf," she said, "and the lighter. I didn't put those on myself." Marlowe looked at the evidence bag on the counter. The gold lighter, the wool scarf, both tagged and logged. She looked at Elena with that gray harbor gaze. "The lighter," she said. "Seahawk." Elena watched Marlowe's face do something she couldn't interpret. A slight contraction around the eyes, an internal recalibration. "You know what it is," Elena said. "I know what it means," Marlowe said carefully. "And I'd appreciate it very much if you didn't lose the police protection you're going to receive tonight." She left the room with Elena's phone, and left behind, in the off-white silence, a specific variety of dread. The dread of understanding that you have stumbled into a story much larger and more dangerous than anything your own life should contain. Elena lay back against the pillow and stared at the muted weather forecast, and thought about a man who moved through black water like a room he owned, who saved her life and left a gold lighter with a hawk's wings spread open like a declaration, and who had disappeared into the blizzard like he had never existed at all. She found herself thinking about his hands, how certain they had been, how, even in her hypothermic, near unconscious state, she had registered something about those hands that had felt less like rescue and more like claiming. She pressed that thought flat before she could examine it further. She was alive. That was enough. For now. They gave her police protection in the form of a single uniformed officer who sat in the hospital corridor with his phone in his lap and the glazed expression of a man whose primary relationship was with boredom. By the time Elena was discharged 2 days later, a Friday, the blizzard long past, the city gleaming under 3 inches of clean white. This had been upgraded to a patrol car parked outside her building. It sat there the way official things sit, visibly, loudly, implying a safety it could not actually guarantee. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a renovated brick building on Wrightwood Avenue. 2 bedrooms, high ceilings, windows that looked west toward the park. She had chosen it for the light and the quiet, both of which she required in substantial quantities. It smelled, when she unlocked the door, of the bergamot candle she burned when she practiced, and the coffee she'd left half-made before the performance 2 nights ago. The most ordinary smell in the world. She stood in the doorway, breathing it, and felt something in her chest release that she hadn't known was clenched. She showered, changed, made the coffee she'd abandoned, sat at the kitchen table with her violin case in front of her. The Guarneri had been recovered from the car before it was towed, miraculously undamaged, as though the lake had understood it was precious, and let herself simply exist in her ordinary life for 20 minutes. Then she heard the window in the 2nd bedroom move. It was a sound she knew, the slight resistance of the old wooden frame, the specific scrape of wood against wood that the building's age had made distinctive. She had learned this sound the way musicians learn sound, with involuntary precision. Someone was coming through her fire escape window. Her phone. She reached for it on the table. Detective Marlowe's number was there. Don't. The voice was low, male, accented faintly in a way she could not immediately place. Eastern European, smoothed by years of deliberate effort into something that was almost neutral. Almost. She froze with her hand on the phone. He came out of the bedroom doorway and into the kitchen light, and she had 1 second to look at him before her fear crystallized into something more complicated. She would think about this afterward, when she was able to think about it clinically, the kind of man that rooms noticed. Not because he was conventionally handsome, though he was that too. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with a face that had been assembled from angles rather than curves. Strong jaw, a nose that had been broken at least once and reset imperfectly, cheekbones that cast shadows. But that wasn't what the room noticed. The room noticed the quality of stillness he carried, the sense that every movement he made was a choice, that nothing was accidental, that this was a man who had lived so long in dangerous situations that he had become, himself, a kind of danger. He was wearing dark clothes, wet at the sleeves and cuffs. He'd come from outside, through the cold, and his dark eyes were fixed on her with an expression that was not threatening, exactly, but was the opposite of apologetic. He set something on her kitchen counter. Her phone. The original recording. The phone Marlowe had taken and returned. He'd been in the hospital, she realized. He'd heard, or somehow obtained, exactly what she'd told the detective. "You recorded something you weren't supposed to hear," he said. His voice was a bass instrument, not loud, didn't need to be. "Who are you?" she managed. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her the way people look at a situation they're assessing. Not at her face, exactly, but at the full composition of her, the way she was standing, where her hands were, what resources were within reach. She had the uncomfortable sensation of being read. "You have the lighter," he said. She looked at the counter. She'd set it there when she came in, half-consciously, as she'd been carrying it in her coat pocket for 2 days. "Yes?" "Then you know something about who I am." "Seahawk," she said. Detective Marlowe recognized it. She watched his face. Nothing changed. "You saved me from the lake." "Yes." "Why?" The question seemed to genuinely interest him. He leaned against the doorframe, still watching her, still with that particular quality of controlled attention, and said, "Because you were drowning." "That's not an answer. You were at the theater. I saw you in the VIP room." She had seen him, fleetingly, from across the room, noticing him the way she noticed things, with an involuntary precision she'd never been able to turn off. He had been standing apart from the gathered wealth and power, holding a glass of whiskey and not drinking it, watching the room with those dark eyes. She had thought, he doesn't belong here, and then immediately corrected herself, because his suit had been Italian and his watch had been significant, and he had been spoken to by 3 separate men with the deference of people who owed someone something. "I belong everywhere and nowhere," he said, as though she had spoken aloud. "That's a professional requirement." "The men in that hospitality suite," she said. "You know who they are." Something in his face shifted, minimally. "Yes." "And they know about the recording?" "They know you exist. They don't yet know what you heard, specifically." They erred toward caution. He said this flatly, without inflection, as one might describe the weather. They erred toward caution. They had cut her brake lines and sent her car into Lake Michigan. Elena sat down. Not because she chose to, her legs simply made that decision on her behalf. "My name is Nikolai Volkov," he said. She knew the name. Not specifically, not in the way of someone who followed criminal news closely, but in the vague, city-wide way that certain names accumulated gravity in a place like Chicago. Names that appeared in the Tribune occasionally, always in contexts that were careful and lawyerly, always in proximity to words like alleged and unconfirmed. The kind of name that doormen and bartenders and cab drivers recognized with a specific expression, a slight widening of the eyes, a recalibration of deference. "The Seahawks," she said. "My organization, yes." "You run the—" She found she couldn't complete the sentence with any confidence. She didn't actually know what he ran. She only knew the weight of the name. "I manage certain interests in this city," he said. "And the men whose conversation you recorded represent a competing interest. From Eastern Europe. They came here to conduct a transaction I would prefer not to see completed, for reasons that are partly business and partly—" A pause that seemed, impossibly, almost reflective, principled. "Heavy armaments," she said. "To whom?" "That is not your concern." "Someone tried to kill me. I think it's slightly my concern." For the first time, something moved in his face that wasn't pure calculation. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, there and gone, like light moving through water. "Fair," he said. The window in the living room shattered inward. Elena was on the floor before she understood she'd moved. Nikolai had crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and taken her down, covering her body with his, and the sound she'd heard resolved into the multiple, overlapping crashes of professional men with automatic weapons entering her apartment simultaneously from the fire escape and the front door, the police protection apparently having been neutralized with a thoroughness that suggested resources and planning. "Up," Nikolai said in her ear. "Now." He moved through her apartment with a familiarity she found both alarming and useful. He had been here before, she realized, or had studied it so carefully that the difference didn't matter. He knew which closet door stuck, pulled her past it without pausing. He knew the service corridor at the back of the building, accessed through the kitchen utility door she had never once opened. He knew the code for the ground floor freight exit, a code she had never been given and didn't know existed. They were outside in the alley behind her building, before the men coming through her front door had cleared the living room. The night was clear and bitter cold, the previous night's snow still pristine in the alley, and Nikolai moved through it without sound, one hand clamped around her wrist, not painfully, but with an absoluteness that made argument irrelevant. She ran. Her coat was inside. She was in wool socks and the jeans and sweater she'd changed into, and the cold was immediate and thorough. But she ran because the alternative was standing still in the alley while men with automatic weapons found her. A black car was idling at the alley's north end. The driver was a young man with a shaved head and the particular quality of calm that she was beginning to recognize as a professional signature. People in Nikolai's orbit seemed to have had panic surgically removed. He said nothing as they got in, simply shifted into gear before the doors were fully closed, and drove. "My violin," she said. Nikolai looked at her. In the passing streetlights, his face was a series of illuminated planes and deep shadows. She couldn't read his expression. "My violin was in the apartment," she said. "The Guarneri. It's irreplaceable. I know what it's worth," he said. Then you understand. It will be collected. He said it with the finality of a man who was accustomed to problems resolving themselves when he spoke. The apartment is compromised. We will not return tonight. She sat in the back of the car and watched her neighborhood recede through the rear window and tried to construct a rational response to what was happening to her. She had no phone. She'd left it on the kitchen table. She had no coat, no wallet, no identification, no charger for the phone she didn't have. She had the gold lighter, still in her jeans pocket, and the wool scarf, which she'd left in the case with the violin, and the fact of a man she'd known for approximately 12 minutes who was the most dangerous person she'd ever been in a room with. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe." "That's not specific enough." "No," he agreed, and looked out his own window and said nothing further. The car took them east, then south along the lakeshore, the dark water of Michigan visible between the buildings, vast and flat and lit silver by the moon, giving no indication that 2 nights ago it had almost swallowed her. She watched it as they passed. She had grown up in this city, had played her first public recital at 12 in a church on the North Shore, had eaten her first oyster and fallen in first love, and suffered her first real failure, all within the compass of this same gray and white city, and it was possible that she was seeing it for the last time. She pushed that thought away. "The police," she said. "The officer outside my building." "Sedated," Nikolai said, "not harmed." "You knew they were coming." "I knew the probability was significant." "Then you knew before you came to my apartment. You came anyway." He turned and looked at her, and in the moonlight through the car window, she could see something in his dark eyes that she would spend a long time afterwards trying to name. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was something more precise than warmth, an attention, a specificity of focus that felt, in spite of every rational signal she was receiving, like being seen. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because you needed to hear certain things. And because the people who want you dead were approximately 40 minutes behind me, and someone should have been there when they arrived." He paused. "And because leaving you alone in that apartment with one underpaid officer and a recording that represents several $100 million in criminal liability seemed—" Another pause, and again that ghost of something, there and gone. "Unacceptable." She turned this over. "You don't know me. I know enough. You know that I play violin and I accidentally recorded something I shouldn't have. I know that you stood in Lake Michigan water that was 34 degrees Fahrenheit and your first concern, after regaining consciousness, was a violin." He said it without particular expression. "I know that you stayed in that hospital for 2 days and told the detective the truth and gave her the recording, even though you could have destroyed it and saved yourself the trouble. I know that you walked into your apartment tonight and made coffee before you called anyone." He looked at her steadily. "I know that you're frightened, and you're not letting it make you foolish. That is, currently, more than enough." She didn't know what to say to that. She looked at her hands in her lap, violinist's hands, long-fingered, calloused at the fingertips in specific places, the left wrist bearing the faint trace of the stress fracture that had healed crooked. And she thought about what it meant that this man had been watching her closely enough to know all of this. The car turned onto Lakeshore Drive and headed south, and the city's skyline drew itself against the dark winter sky behind them, all that glass and steel and light, and Elena Vance pressed her shoulder against the cold car door and accepted, with the pragmatic resignation of a woman who had chosen to spend her life in the pursuit of beauty in a world that made no promises, that her life had just become something she didn't entirely recognize. An hour later, they reached a private marina on the South Shore where a boat was waiting, a dark, substantial vessel that said nothing about itself, occupied by 2 men with the same surgically removed panic as the driver. Nikolai helped her aboard with a hand under her elbow that was completely impersonal and somehow, against all logic, the most careful thing anyone had ever done for her. The boat moved out onto the dark lake. This, she thought, watching the city's lights diminish behind them, is how women disappear from their lives. And then, absurdly, unwillingly, I'm warm. He gave me his coat. She looked down. She was wearing his black wool overcoat, which had appeared on her shoulders somewhere in the rush of leaving, and she had not noticed it until now. It was heavy and smelled of cedar and something darker, wood smoke or whiskey, or simply the specific scent of a man who moved through dangerous nights as a matter of professional routine. She pulled it tighter and watched Chicago dissolve into the winter dark and said nothing at all. The island appeared out of the lake like something from a dream that hadn't decided yet whether it was good or bad. It was perhaps 2 acres, Elena estimated, with a stone pier extending into the water and a path of pale gravel leading upward through planted trees. Old growth. Evergreens that had no business being this size, this far from shore. Toward a house that revealed itself gradually as the path curved. First the windows, lit amber against the dark, then the roofline, and then the full thing, a rambling compound in stone and dark timber that looked as though it had grown from the island rather than been constructed on it. 4 stories at its tallest point, wings extending in both directions, lit with the kind of warm and specific light that required considerable thought to achieve. It was, objectively, one of the most beautiful buildings she had ever seen. She said nothing about this. She followed Nikolai up the pier, past 2 men who materialized from the tree line and exchanged wordless looks with him, and through a door of dark-stained oak into an entry hall that smelled of old wood and beeswax and something floral she couldn't immediately identify. A woman appeared, mid-50s, gray-haired, built with the compact efficiency of someone who had spent a life in useful motion. She took in Elena's state, coatless except for the borrowed overcoat, socked feet, still slightly damp about the edges from the cold, with a complete absence of judgment. "This is Marta," Nikolai said. "She runs the house. Whatever you need." Marta's English was accented, her expression measuring but not unkind. "You'll want a bath first," she said to Elena, in the tone of a statement rather than a question. "Then something to eat, then sleep. In that order." Elena, who was in no condition to argue the sequence, nodded. She was given a room on the 3rd floor, large, wood-paneled, with a fireplace that Marta lit with the casual expertise of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and a window that looked out over the dark lake. The bathroom was equipped with serious seriousness. Deep tub, heavy towels, bath salts that smelled of eucalyptus. She soaked until the hypothermic memory left her bones, and then she sat, wrapped in the largest towel she had ever encountered, and looked at herself in the steam-fogged mirror and tried to recognize the person looking back. Marta brought food, soup, dark bread, tea in a heavy ceramic cup. Elena ate at the small table by the window and watched the lake and didn't think about anything for 30 minutes. This was a discipline she had learned from music, the ability to simply occupy a moment without processing it, to exist in a space before understanding. Then she slept, deeply and without dreams, which surprised her. When she woke, it was to gray morning light and the sound of someone playing music downstairs. She lay still and listened. Not live music, recorded. Vinyl, she determined from the particular warmth and slight grain of the sound quality, rising through the old floorboards with the intimacy of something that had no interest in being performed. Shostakovich. String Quartet No. 8, the 2nd movement, the Allegro molto, which was not actually allegro at all, but a kind of violent desperation, the quartet racing as though it were being pursued. She did not expect to find this music in this house. She dressed in clothes that had been left folded on the chair, her own, she realized, laundered, the clothes she'd been wearing when she was discharged from the hospital. Someone had collected them. Someone with access to her apartment had gotten in and out before the men with automatic weapons arrived, or after, or both. She tucked this fact away. She followed the music downstairs. The house was larger than the exterior had suggested, organized around a central hall, with corridors branching in multiple directions, all of it furnished with a combination of function and genuine aesthetic attention that surprised her. Dark wood, good rugs in colors that had nothing to do with trend or performance, bookshelves covering complete wall surfaces in multiple rooms. She followed the sound of the Shostakovich through a corridor lined with framed concert posters, Russian orchestras, Chicago symphony programs, a 1987 Bernstein at Carnegie Hall, and through a door into a room that was organized entirely around music. Nikolai was sitting in a leather chair with his back to her, a glass of water on the table beside him, and a stack of record sleeves on the floor. The turntable, serious equipment, Japanese, the kind that cost what a car cost, turned with quiet precision. He had changed into dark trousers and a gray sweater, and he was entirely still, listening with the specific quality of stillness that she recognized from other musicians, from conductors, from people for whom music was not ambient but primary. He knew she was there. He had known before she crossed the threshold. She'd felt his awareness of her like a change in air pressure. But he didn't turn immediately. He let the movement finish. 4 minutes and 22 seconds, she counted, standing in the doorway, listening to Shostakovich's desperation fill the room. When the needle reached the end of the passage and lifted, he turned. "You slept," he said. "You have an extraordinary collection," she said, because it was true, and because it was less frightening to say than anything else she might have said. Something in his expression, which was, as a rule, a controlled and largely unreadable thing, shifted slightly. He looked at the shelves. "Since I was 15, he said, "when everything else was unreliable, music stayed true." She came further into the room. The shelves were floor to ceiling on 3 walls, organized with the obsessive precision she recognized from her own apartment. Genre, then chronology, then conductor or performer. Thousands of records. Chamber music, symphonies, opera, jazz in a separate section. Some folk recordings in Cyrillic-labeled sleeves she didn't recognize. "You knew the Sibelius," she said. "You were at the performance. You stayed for all of it." He looked at her with those dark eyes. "I have heard the Sibelius 17 times," he said, "in 6 cities. Yours was—" a pause. "The most honest interpretation I have encountered." She was not ready for this. She sat down in the other chair, because her legs had made that decision again. "Honest," she repeated. "Most performers play what Sibelius wrote," he said. "You played what Sibelius felt. There is a significant difference." He picked up the Shostakovich sleeve from the floor, turned it in his hands. "The second movement, the one I was listening to. He wrote it in 1960 in 3 days. His own response to a life lived under a regime that decided what was permitted to be said. He put everything that couldn't be spoken into those 40 minutes. He set the sleeve down. I find that comprehensible." She looked at him for a long moment. "Marta made breakfast," he said, and stood, and the conversation, which had been something she didn't have a word for yet, closed as cleanly as a door. She established parameters for herself on the second day. This was a practice she developed in conservatory, where the demands of the discipline had been such that without structure you simply dissolved. You had to know where you stood, what you owned, what was given and what was taken. She applied the same framework to the island. What she knew. She was being protected, not held. Nikolai had said this explicitly, and she was not certain why she believed him, given everything, but she did. She believed it. The door to her room had no lock on the outside. Marta brought her meals but did not restrict her movement. She had explored the ground floor freely on the second morning, and had been stopped by no one. What she didn't know? Approximately everything else. The island had a rhythm she was slowly learning. Nikolai disappeared for long hours into what she came to think of as the operations wing, the eastern section of the house, which had a different quality of activity to it, coming and going, voices in multiple languages, the low electronic sounds of equipment she chose not to think about too carefully. He reappeared in the evenings, and they ate dinner with Marta at the long table in the kitchen, which was the warmest room in the house, and the conversation was careful and partial and unexpectedly good. He knew things. This was the fact she kept encountering, that kept disrupting her categorization of him. He knew about the 1968 Prague Spring and its relationship to the music Dvorak had written 70 years earlier in another context of exile. He knew about the specific metallurgical properties that made Stradivari's instruments irreproducible, and he had an opinion about it that was informed and argued. He knew about Chicago's architectural history and the ways it expressed the anxieties of each decade that had built in it. And he spoke of this not as a man performing erudition, but as a man who had made a study of it because he found it genuinely interesting. He asked about her, not with the generic courtesy of social lubrication, but with specific, targeted questions that suggested he had been listening to everything she'd said previously and had thought about it. On the third evening, he asked, "Your left wrist, the fracture, when?" She was surprised. 4 years ago. How did you... The way you hold the bow, slightly elevated. Compensation. His eyes on her hands were the eyes of someone accustomed to reading what bodies said when mouths were not speaking. You didn't stop performing. I took 8 weeks off. She paused. 12, technically. I started again at 8. Why? Because if I stopped, something I'd built would... She searched for the word. Calcify. Become unreachable. He nodded, as though this required no further translation. She asked about the scars on the third day. She hadn't meant to. She'd seen them when he'd come downstairs one morning in a shirt that was not fully buttoned, moving quickly from one room to another before he'd registered her presence in the corridor, and she had seen them across his back. Broad, complex, layered. The kind of scarring that came not from a single event, but from a sustained history of violence applied to a body that had been too young to deflect it. She hadn't spoken then, but on the third evening she did, with the directness she'd learned was the only register worth operating in with this man. "You're back," she said. The kitchen went very quiet. Marta had left them with their tea. The fire was low. Nikolai set his cup down. He did not look at her immediately, and she watched him decide whether to speak. She could see it, the deliberation, the internal negotiation between privacy and something else she couldn't name. "My father," he said finally, "had a particular relationship with vodka and with his belt." He said it without inflection, as a statement of historical fact. And a particular conviction that difficulty made men. He applied this conviction comprehensively. She said nothing. She had learned, with students and in life, that silence was the only appropriate response to certain kinds of disclosure. "I left at 13, he said, which in the context of where I grew up, outside Odessa in the 90s, after the Soviet Union had come apart and taken the social infrastructure with it, meant that I was entirely self-reliant from 13, which had certain developmental implications." She absorbed this. "Is that when you became what I am?" He looked at her directly. "Yes, though the process was gradual. It required 15 years and a particular set of circumstances and a city, eventually, that had space for what I'd become." He picked up his tea. "Chicago is, historically, accommodating to a certain kind of ambition." She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh. It came from somewhere unguarded, a short, genuine sound, and his expression, in response to it, was briefly the expression of a man who had been given something unexpected and didn't know immediately what to do with it. "What is funny?" he asked, without offense. "That's possibly the most diplomatic description of organized crime I've ever heard." The ghost of something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Closer this time. "I am, when necessary, diplomatic." "When is it not necessary?" He considered this with genuine seriousness. "Less often than you might think." She thought about the men who had come through her window, the weapons, the ease with which a police officer had been neutralized and an apartment had been stormed. She thought about the SUV in the blizzard and the brake lines cut with needle-nose pliers. "The people who are after me," she said, "the Eastern Europeans, who are they?" "A syndicate. led by a man named Dragomir Kessler. He operates primarily in arms trafficking between Eastern Europe and specific buyers in several markets I'd prefer not to be more specific about. The shipment you're recording documents is his largest transaction in 18 months. Its exposure would be catastrophic for him, financially and legally. And for you? He looked at her steadily. I have no investment in Kessler's transaction succeeding or failing, except that I have a general preference for certain categories of weapons not reaching certain categories of hands, and a specific preference for women who play Sibelius not dying in frozen lakes. She held his gaze. The fire crackled between them. Nikolai, she said, using his name for the first time, and watched something in his face respond to it with a precision she chose, for now, not to examine. Why did you come to my apartment? The real reason, not the strategic one. The silence was long. Outside, the lake made its quiet, ceaseless sound against the island's shore. Because I watched you play Sibelius, he said at last, and I found that I could not subsequently walk away from a problem that concerned you and call myself something I prefer to remain. He picked up his cup, stood, and went to bed. She sat by the dying fire for a long time and listened to the lake and tried to make sense of a world that had reorganized itself around her without her permission. On the 5th day, she asked for her violin. She had been keeping the request held back, partly because asking felt like an acknowledgement that she was settling in, making herself at home in a place that was not her home, and with a man who was not safe. Partly because the violin was a need that went deeper than preference, a physiological requirement that had been true since she was 7 years old, and she had been reluctant to expose this particular vulnerability. Marta brought it to her room that morning. The case, her rosin, her spare bow, her shoulder rest, the small leather pouch of tools she traveled with, everything collected from her apartment, nothing missing. She opened the case and checked the instrument with the thoroughness of a ritual that predated thought, running her fingers along the scroll, checking the bridge alignment, tuning with her ear and the Korg clip tuner she'd used since high school, pressing the bow to the string lightly to feel the tension. She began to play. There was no performance in it, no audience consideration, no presentation. She began with scales, the most basic ground, muscle memory reinstated after 5 days of absence, and then moved through exercises, and then into a Bach partita she had been working on for a recital she was now uncertain she would ever give. The room was good for sound, high ceiling, wood surfaces, the slight reflectiveness of stone in the walls, creating a natural reverb that was generous without being muddy. She played for 2 hours. At some point she became aware that the door to her room, which she had left ajar, had been opened further. Nikolai stood in the doorway. He was not pretending to be passing by. He was simply there, arms loosely at his sides, watching her play, with an expression that was, for the first time in the days she'd been observing him, uncontrolled. Not the ghost of something, not the carefully managed shift of a near expression. He was just listening, and the listening was, she played a long, sustained note in the upper register and watched him close his eyes briefly, involuntarily, and felt something move through her that had nothing to do with the music and everything to do with it at the same time. She finished the partita's first movement and lowered the bow. "Come in," she said, "if you're going to stand there." He came in and sat in the chair near the window without speaking. "Request?" she asked. He thought about it. The Arvo part, Spiegel im Spiegel. She knew it. Everyone knew it. Mirror in the mirror. 11 minutes of the most heartbreakingly simple writing in the contemporary repertoire. 2 instruments, piano and violin, each reflecting the other in overlapping arpeggios. The whole thing barely louder than a conversation. "I don't have a pianist," she said. "Play it without, the violin part alone." She looked at him. "It'll be incomplete, half the piece." "Yes," he said. She played it. The violin part of Spiegel im Spiegel alone was a strange and lonely thing, a melody that kept reaching for its reflection and not finding it, ascending and descending in the silence where the piano should have been. She played it slowly, slightly slower than indicated, letting each note have its full weight. And in the room, with the winter light and the dark lake through the window, and this man sitting perfectly still in the chair, it was one of the most interior performances she had ever given. When it ended, neither of them spoke for a while. "Why that piece?" she asked finally. He looked at his hands. "I heard it first in a car, in 1999, driving away from a situation I would prefer not to describe. The radio. I did not know what it was. I had to stop the car because I could not drive and listen at the same time." He paused. "I have since heard it perhaps 200 times. It does not become less—" He searched for the word. "Precise." "Pert calls it tintinnabuli," she said. "His own term. Derived from the Latin for bells. The idea that you strip everything away until only the essential notes remain." She turned the bow in her hands. "He developed it after a period where he couldn't compose at all. 8 years of silence. He said he needed to find the note, singular, that contained everything." Nikolai looked at her with those dark, still eyes. "What is your note?" he asked. The question surprised her. She thought about it seriously. He deserved that. "The A string," she said at last. "Open. No vibrato. The most exposed note on the instrument. Nothing to hide behind." He nodded, as though this were exactly the answer he'd expected. They began to spend the afternoons like this. She would play, he would listen. Sometimes she spoke about what she was playing, the history, the theory, the personal, and he listened with the quality of attention that was his most disarming characteristic, complete, focused, requiring nothing from her but honesty. Sometimes he said things that were more perceptive than she expected, observations about tension and resolution, about the way a phrase established an expectation, and the composer's decision whether to fulfill or subvert it. "That's essentially what you do," she said one afternoon, surprising herself. "Professionally. You establish expectations and decide whether to fulfill them." He looked at her with an expression she was learning to read as amused. "I had not considered the musicological dimension of my work." "The threat of harm that doesn't need to be executed," she said, "because the possibility is the instrument." "That is," he paused, "more accurate than I'd like to admit." "Do you enjoy it?" she asked. "The power?" The amusement faded. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to most things. "I enjoy the clarity," he said. "When you are powerful enough, there are no ambiguous situations. Everything resolves." A pause. "Though lately I find I prefer ambiguity." He was looking at her when he said this. She looked away, back at her violin, and began to tune it with unnecessary care. That night she dreamed of the lake, the cold water, the darkness, the pressure, and woke in the small hours gasping. She sat up in the dark and pressed her hands to her face and breathed, 4 counts in, 7 hold, 8 out, and heard a sound in the corridor. Footsteps, pausing outside her door. A knock, so soft it was barely distinguishable from a question. "Elena." "I'm fine," she said. "I know you're fine." His voice through the door was low and careful. "The kitchen, if you want tea." She didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, "I'll be down in a minute." The kitchen at 3 a.m. was amber-lit and warm, the fire banked but still throwing heat, the old house quiet around them in a way that felt, not peaceful exactly, but like the specific silence of a place that had decided to allow you to exist in it. Nikolai was at the stove, with his back to her, when she came in, wearing dark trousers and a gray Henley, and no shoes. The first time she'd seen him without shoes. The first time she'd seen him in any state that approximated the ordinary. And the domesticity of it struck her with a force she hadn't anticipated. He set a cup in front of her without turning around completely. Chamomile and something else. Honey. Actual honey stirred in, which she had mentioned once in passing as her preference, and had not expected him to retain. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The dream, she said. Do you still dream about the things that... She stopped. No, he said, sitting across from her. I stopped dreaming a long time ago. Or the dream stopped. I'm not certain which came first. He looked at her steadily. But I am awake most nights anyway. If there is... Another pause. If you need something in the night, you don't need to be alone with it. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the 3 a.m. quiet. His dark hair was slightly disordered. His face, without the formal composure of the daylight hours, was something rawer. Not younger, exactly, but closer to whatever he had been before he'd learned to wear the mask. She thought, I am in serious trouble. Thank you, she said, for the tea and for everything else, and meant it for both. A week passed, then another. The investigation, Marlowe had communicated through an intermediary that Nikolai seemed to have inside the department. Elena did not ask about this, was proceeding in the slow, careful way of investigations that involved international criminal organizations and federal jurisdiction disputes, and bureaucratic processes that moved at speeds incompatible with the urgency of a woman in a lake. Elena marked time in music and conversation and the slow, incremental education of a person. On the 9th day, she found the photographs. She had not been snooping. This was important to her as a point of self-understanding, that she had not been deliberately looking. She had been in the library, which occupied the northeast wing of the house, and which she'd been given unrestricted access to, looking for something to read in the original Russian. The shelves were multilingual, organized with the same obsessive care as the record collection. When a folder had slipped from the shelf, and she'd caught it, and the photographs had come out. Black and white, old, late 80s, early 90s, based on the print quality. A boy, clearly him. The same angular face in its earlier form. The same dark eyes, though in the photographs they had something in them that the adult version had learned to remove. A rawness, a kind of animal alertness that was painful to look at. He was thin in the photographs, thin in the way of insufficient food rather than natural build. And there was a photograph of him in what appeared to be a training facility of some kind. Older men, younger men, all with the same quality of focused violence. And there was another one of him alone, sitting on a concrete step somewhere, with a book, looking not at the camera, but at something beyond it, with an expression she could only describe as the expression of a person cataloging their own circumstances and deciding what to do about them. She was looking at the last photograph when she became aware of him behind her. She didn't flinch. She turned slowly and held the photograph up. He looked at it, then at her. His face was nothing. The mask was back, completely. 13, he said. Yes, she said. I can tell. She set it down on the table with care. I'm not going to say I'm sorry. I know you don't want that. What do you want to say? That she thought carefully, understand why you are the way you are, which is different from excusing it and different from condemning it. I just understand it. He was very still. The world you grew up in, she said. You had to become what you became to survive it. And then you discovered that you were good at it, and that being good at it meant the world couldn't hurt you anymore. And so you stayed. The silence was long enough that she thought he wasn't going to respond. Then, yes. Do you want to stay? She asked. Still? Now? He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Something unguarded, something with an uncertainty in it that was startling on his face. He was a man, she had come to understand, who did not permit himself uncertainty, who had methodically eliminated every context in which uncertainty was possible. I am beginning, he said carefully, to not be certain of the answer to that question. She put the photographs back in the folder and the folder back on the shelf. She selected the Bulgakov novel she'd been looking for, The Master and Margarita, because she was in the mood for a devil who kept good company, and she turned and said, Are you going to stand in doorways watching me read? or do you want to sit down?" He sat down. On the other side of the library table, with his own book, she didn't see what it was until later, and when she saw it was Chekhov's letters, she felt something she chose not to examine fold open in her chest. They read in silence for 2 hours. It was, she decided, one of the best afternoons of her life. On the 12th day, she witnessed him in a professional context for the first time. She had been in the music room when raised voices from the operations wing cut through the walls, loud enough that she registered them as unusual, which meant they were significantly elevated. Then quiet. Then Nikolai coming through the music room with the purposeful, kinetic energy she'd come to associate with his working mode, and he had stopped when he saw her, and something had happened to his face, a brief, involuntary softening, as though her presence were a variable his calculations hadn't accounted for, and continued not accounting for. "Stay in this wing," he said. "What's happening?" "Nothing that requires you to know about it currently." She stood. "Is it Kessler?" He paused. "A complication. I'll be back within 2 hours." "Nikolai." He turned. The way he turned to his name from her mouth was specific, attentive in a way that was different from his attention to everything else. "Be careful," she said, and hated that she'd said it, because it made visible something she wasn't ready to have visible. He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes. "I am always careful," he said. "It is a professional requirement." He paused at the door. "But thank you." He was back in 90 minutes, not 2 hours, and she had stayed in the music room with her violin, but had not played much, and was standing at the window, looking at the lake, when she heard his footsteps in the corridor. She did not go to the door. He knocked. "Come in," she said. He came in and looked at her where she stood by the window, and she looked at him, and the room had the particular charge of the moments before significant weather, when the air pressure drops and something that has been building announces its intention to resolve. She asked, "Is everything—" "Fine," he said. "Resolved." He came further into the room. He was close enough now that she was aware of the height of him, the breadth, the contained power that he moved in, like a second skin. He smelled of cold air and wood smoke. He reached out and pushed a strand of hair from her face, a gesture so simple and so deliberate that she stopped breathing entirely, and his fingertips barely grazed her cheekbone, and he stood there for a moment with his hand still raised, looking at her with that expression she still didn't have a word for. Then he stepped back. "Dinner in an hour," he said. He left. She turned back to the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass and said, quietly, to the dark lake, "Well." Days 13 through 16 were the worst and the best simultaneously, which was the kind of arithmetic that only made sense in hindsight. The worst. Marlowe's intermediary delivered news that the officer who'd been sedated outside Elena's building had suffered an unexpected allergic reaction to the sedative compound used and was in intensive care. Not Nikolai's men, the dosage and compound matched Kessler's known methods, but the effect was the same. A man was hurt because Elena existed in the world, and the weight of that sat on her chest with a specific, unshifting gravity. The best, she was learning Nikolai Volkov. Not in full. He remained in many dimensions a closed room, and she was not naive enough to think she had access to all of it, or that she should. A man who had built an empire in the Chicago underworld was, necessarily, in possession of secrets that she did not want in her own head, and that he would not share, regardless. She had accepted this. She was learning him in the available dimensions, the ones he chose to make available, gradually, with the particular care of someone who had not previously offered this kind of proximity to anyone, and was uncertain of the protocol. He came to the music room every afternoon, always after knocking, always waiting for her answer, and sitting in the same chair with a glass of water and listening with that complete, still attention that she had come to need in a way she hadn't needed anything except music. He began to tell her things. Not confessions, nothing dramatic, but the accumulation of small things that constituted a life. What he had eaten on his first night in Chicago, a Polish beef sandwich from a diner on Milwaukee Avenue, which he had found extraordinary. The name of the Odessa teacher who had first put a record on for him, Swan Lake, bizarrely, and changed the direction of something. That he had once, briefly, attempted to learn piano, and that his hands were wrong for it, too accustomed to other uses, and that this remained a specific, quiet regret. She offered things in return. The conservatory years, the professor who'd left her the Guarneri and what he'd said about her playing in the last lesson before he died. You hear the shape of silence, Elena, which is what most players never learn to do. The particular loneliness of excellence, of having something that set you apart, and finding that it set you apart even from the people who most appreciated it. The fracture, and the 8 weeks, and what it had felt like to pick up the bow again for the first time, and discover that the music was still there. On day 15 it rained, a cold, determined November rain that made the island feel both smaller and more contained, the lake invisible beyond the curtain of it, the house warm and enclosed around them. Marta made a lamb stew that smelled extraordinary. Elena played for 2 hours in the morning and then came downstairs to find Nikolai in the kitchen with flour on his hands. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. Something crossed his face. Not quite embarrassment, because she did not think he was susceptible to embarrassment, but something adjacent, a mild self-consciousness, quickly controlled. Marta has a cold, he said. She is resting. I am... A pause. Managing. You're baking. I am attempting bread. He looked at the mass of dough on the counter, with the expression of a man who was accustomed to things proceeding as intended, and was recalibrating. The dough is... resistant. She came into the kitchen, looked at the dough. You haven't let it rest long enough. Gluten needs time to relax. I am aware that impatience is a liability, he said dryly. Not in bread. In bread it's fatal. She washed her hands at the sink. Can I? Yes, he said immediately, and stepped back from the counter, and she took the dough and worked it, which was a thing she'd learned from her grandmother, with the same hands that had learned to hold a bow, and she could feel him watching her from where he stood 3 feet away, and the kitchen was warm, and the rain was on the windows, and the lamb was in the oven, and it was the most domestic moment of her adult life, and she was sharing it with a crime lord in a fortified island house in the middle of Lake Michigan, and it was somehow, incomprehensibly, completely natural. My grandmother taught me, she said, working the dough. She made bread every Sunday, the kind of Sunday baking that takes all day. The house smelled of it. Where was this? Portland. She came from Kiev, in the 60s, before... She glanced at him. Various things made it difficult to leave. She brought the bread recipe and a set of sheet music and 1 photograph, and she considered herself wealthy. He was quiet for a moment. My grandmother also baked bread, he said, before... A pause. Before my father's particular relationship with certain substances made household normalcy unreliable. She let the dough rest under the cloth. Did she love you? Elena asked. Your grandmother. Fiercely, he said, without hesitation. She was the... Another pause, and she watched him navigate something internal. The first person who made me understand that safety was a thing that existed, that it was a possibility. He looked at the cloth covering the dough. She died when I was 9. She turned and looked at him directly. He met her gaze with that dark steadiness, but underneath it now she could see what lay beneath. The 13-year-old on the concrete step, looking beyond the camera, cataloging and deciding. I'm glad she existed, Elena said, for those 9 years. He looked at her for a long moment. So am I, he said. The bread turned out well. They ate it warm with the stew, the 2 of them at the kitchen table, with the rain on the windows and Marta resting upstairs, and the conversation moved through music and architecture, and at one point, a profound disagreement about Dostoevsky. She preferred the brothers Karamazov. He insisted Notes from Underground was the truer book, arguing that it was the only one that admitted the full scope of what people were capable of being inside their own heads. "You're more pessimistic than I expected," she said. "I know people," he said. "So do I," she said, "and I still prefer the brothers." He looked at her. "Because of Alyosha." "Because of Alyosha," she confirmed. "The man who believes goodness is possible," he said. "Not with contempt, with something more complex." "Is it?" she asked. The question lay between them. The rain continued. He looked at her across the table with an expression that had given up, for this moment, on being controlled. "I am beginning to think so," he said. "Yes." On the 17th day, the Guarneri spoke to her. This was how she always described it, not playing the violin, but listening to it. The instrument had 300 years of accumulated resonance in its wood, the literal, physical record of every sound it had produced. And when she played it in certain moods, it told her things. Today, working through the Brahms Sonata No. 1 in G major, it told her she was in love. She sat in the music room with the bow in her lap and looked at the winter lake and accepted this information with the equanimity of someone who has already done the arguing and lost. It was not convenient. It was not safe. It was, by any rational account, the worst possible emotion to have developed for the worst possible person in the worst possible circumstances. She had known Nikolai Volkov for 17 days, many of them spent in a state of sustained physiological stress, which she was aware could produce attachment responses that owed more to cortisol than to genuine affinity. She had considered all of this. She was still in love with him. She knew the specific moment it had crystallized, looking back. Not the touch in the music room, not the late-night kitchen, not even the afternoons of music and reading. It had been a smaller thing than any of those. 3 days ago, she had come downstairs at 7 in the morning and found him on the floor of the library, cross-legged, with a child's book open in front of him, reading it with the same focused attention he brought to Chekhov. She had looked closer. It was a Russian picture book, the kind printed on thick cardboard with simplified illustrations, the kind sold in touristy Slavic markets, the kind intended for children of 3 or 4. He had looked up, and she had looked at the book, and he had said, with complete composure, "One of my men has a daughter. She is learning to read. I am verifying the text for accuracy." She had looked at the book, Kolobak, the little round bread creature who rolls away from everyone and is eaten by a fox. A classic. "Is it accurate?" she had said. "Mostly," he had said. "The fox is more sympathetic in the original than I remembered." She had gone to make coffee and had stood at the kitchen window, looking at the gray lake, and had understood that she was in a great deal of trouble. Now, in the music room, she picked up the bow and began the Brahms again, from the beginning. The sonata was a love story, technically, written by Brahms during the period when his feelings for Clara Schumann were at their most unconsumable, when he loved her with the kind of love that has nowhere to go, and so becomes music instead. She played it with more honesty than she had intended. Nikolai appeared in the doorway at the usual hour. She did not pause. She played through the first movement's exposition, aware of him settling into the chair, and when she finished and lowered the bow, she turned to face him. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it honestly." He was already watching her with attention that confirmed her theory about the cortisol response. "Yes," he said. "The people looking for me, Kessler. What is his timeline? When does the shipment arrive?" A slight shift in his expression. This was not, she knew, what he'd thought she was going to ask. "End of the week," he said. "If we allow him to make the transaction, your recording becomes irrelevant. He'll have completed the deal and moved on. Your value as a liability decreases. He paused. If we obstruct it, he has continued motivation to neutralize the evidence, which includes you. So you're planning to obstruct it, she said. Yes. Why? If it means continued danger to... She stopped herself. To your operation. He looked at her steadily. I told you, certain weapons reaching certain hands is principled, she finished, using his word from days ago. She looked at him. Is it really? Or is it something else? The silence this time was different, heavier. Both, he said. She turned back to her violin and ran her thumb along the strings without sound, a habit when she was thinking. After this is over, she said, carefully, what happens to me? You go home, he said. You play Sibelius. You teach Tuesday violin lessons. Your life returns. And you? Return to mine. She nodded. She kept her face turned away from him while she nodded. Elena, she turned. He was standing now. He'd moved from the chair without her noticing, because he moved like that, without warning. And he was perhaps 4 feet away, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. After this is over, he said, I have no intention of... He stopped. Something in his jaw. A controlled struggle. I am not a man who permits himself. Another stop. Nikolai, she said softly. You deserve a life, he said, with a directness that felt like it had broken through something rather than been chosen. The kind that doesn't involve late-night escapes through fire exits and armed men on islands. You deserve Tuesday violin lessons and concerts and all of it. You deserve all of it. His voice had something raw in it now. I am aware of what I am and what I am not. She looked at him. I'm aware of what you are, she said, just as directly. I've been sitting in a room with you for 17 days. I've heard you argue about Dostoevsky and watched you make bread, and listened to you talk about your grandmother and the music and... She stopped, drew a breath. I know what you are, Nikolai. I'm asking what you want, not what you've decided is appropriate. What you want. The silence was the longest one yet. He crossed the 4 feet between them in a single, unhurried step, and he put one hand against her jaw. Just one. Just the fingertips. Just the most careful possible approximation of a touch. And looked at her with those dark eyes from a distance of inches. And he said, You. I want you. I have wanted nothing else since I pulled you out of the lake, and you woke up, and your first thought was for a violin. She kissed him, or he kissed her. The distinction, in the event, was irrelevant. They met in the middle of those 4 feet with the simultaneity of two objects that had been moving toward each other since the beginning, and had finally run out of distance between them. And the kiss was not tentative, not exploratory, not the testing of a first kiss. It was the kiss of people who had been accumulating this for days, and were simply finally being honest about it. He kissed her the way he did everything, with complete attention, with the sense that he had decided to do this thing, and had committed to it entirely. His hands in her hair, hers against his chest. When they finally separated, she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and neither of them said anything, because nothing would have added to it. Outside, the lake made its slow, patient sound. Inside, in the quiet of the island house, Elena Vance understood that she had given something to this man that she could not take back, and discovered, to her considerable surprise, that she didn't want to. In the days that followed, the island became a different country. The same stone, the same water, the same amber-lit rooms and old wood and Marta's meals and the record collection turning slowly in the music room. But the light had changed, in the way that light changes when you're looking at it for the first time, from a different angle. Everything the same and nothing the same, because the person doing the looking had shifted. He woke earlier now. She heard him at 5:30, sometimes 5. moving through the house with the quiet purpose of a man who had lived alone for a long time and was finding that he was no longer alone and didn't know what to do with that information except to move through it carefully. She found coffee made when she came down. She found the record player already on. Always her music, she noticed. Not his usual selections, but things she'd mentioned in passing, things she'd played for him, things she'd taught him to hear differently. He was learning her the way she'd been learning him, in the available dimensions, with a precision that made her feel both seen and exposed. One morning, she found him in the library with a music theory textbook, one of hers, from the apartment. He was working through it with the same focused attention he brought to everything, making notes in the margin in his small, precise handwriting. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment, and felt something so enormous and so difficult to name that she put her hand against the doorframe for balance. He looked up and saw her. "The theory of modulation," he said, unapologetically. "I want to understand how you do it. The moment when the key changes, what it requires." She sat down across from him. "Courage," she said, "mostly, and trust that the new key will hold." He looked at her steadily. "Does it always hold?" "If you've done the preparation, yes." She paused. "If you haven't," she paused again, "you go back to the original key. Or you find a third one." He looked at the textbook, then at her. Something moved in his face. "I have not spent significant time in a third key," he said. "I know," she said. "I know that. I'm here anyway." The mornings were hers. She practiced. She existed in the music room with the lake light. She ran lightly through the island's perimeter in the cold air, with two of his men trailing at a professional distance, which she had stopped finding either comforting or strange, and now simply accepted as the condition of her current life. The afternoons were theirs, the shared rooms, the conversations that went longer each day, the growing ease of two people who had stopped performing caution for each other. The evenings were different. In the evenings, Nikolai was often working. Calls, meetings with men who arrived by boat and were led to the operations wing. And Elena read in the library, or practiced quietly, or talked with Marta, who had disclosed nothing about herself except that she had worked for Nikolai for 11 years, and that she considered him, in Marta's exact, careful phrasing, a better man than the world gave him occasion to be, which Elena was increasingly inclined to agree with. But he always came to her before she went to sleep. Always. Even on the evenings when she didn't know he was back until she heard the knock on the music room door, or the library door, or wherever she'd settled. He came and sat, and the conversation was whatever it was, and she understood that this, for him, was a need. Her company, the specific dailiness of her, was a need he was permitting himself for the first time. They talked about the future only obliquely. She had not pushed. He had not offered. She understood the parameters of what was possible, and she understood that he understood them too, and that they were both, for now, in the third key, the one that was neither original nor predicted, the one that required simply being where you were. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said one evening. They were in the music room, with the fire properly lit for once, not banked, but burning well, and she was on the floor, with her back against his chair, and he was behind her, and the position was intimate in a specific, trusted way that was different from and more significant than their earlier kisses. "That is an open-ended invitation," he said. "I know. That's deliberate." He was quiet for a while. She felt him thinking, the particular quality of it, how it was different from his silences of calculation. "I was offered," he said slowly, "some years ago, a position, with a federal agency, in exchange for certain information. They were persuasive." A pause. "I declined." "Why?" "Because it would have required me to betray men who had trusted me with their lives, and I had decided, young and irrevocably, that loyalty was the one thing I would not compromise. Whatever else I compromised." A pause. I have done things, Elena. I am not going to romanticize what I am, but I have never broken faith with a man who trusted me. She thought about this. The mole, she said. The person who sold your operation to Kessler's people. How do you know there is one? She felt him still, completely. Because we covered our tracks well enough, he said carefully. The men who came to your apartment knew the address. Not many people knew where you were. The list is short. Do you know who it is? A pause. I have a strong hypothesis. And I am being careful, he said, because I have been wrong about people before, and the consequences of acting on wrong information, he stopped, are things I don't permit myself to repeat. She turned and looked up at him. His jaw was tight. His eyes, looking into the fire, had that quality she recognized now. The boy on the concrete step, cataloging and deciding. Be careful, she said again. He looked down at her. That expression, the unguarded one, the one that was only hers, moved across his face. I find that, he said quietly, is becoming easier to take seriously. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. He closed his eyes briefly, that involuntary response, the one he couldn't seem to control and had stopped trying to. Play something, he said, before we lose the fire. She picked up the violin from the stand. She played the parrot again, the incomplete piece, the half that reached for its reflection. And this time, sitting with his chair at her back and the fire before her and the dark lake beyond the window, she felt, for the first time in the 11 minutes of its duration, that the silence where the piano should have been was not empty. The 23rd day brought Dmitri. She had not thought much about Dmitri, who was one of the inner ring, the 8 or so men who occupied the operational center of what Nikolai ran. She had encountered them all at various points, coming and going, present at meals occasionally, shadowy figures in the operations wing. They were, without exception, polite to her in the way of people following instructions whose content they had largely accepted without question. They called her Ms. Vance and held doors, and did not comment on her presence or her relationship to their employer. Dmitri was different from the others in a way she had registered without categorizing. Younger, late 20s, with an expressive quality to his face that the others had learned to suppress. He was clever. She could see it in the way he listened, the speed of his assessments, and he had an easy, surface warmth that she'd noticed made Nikolai slightly watchful in his presence. She had, without thinking much about it, been assembling this. It came together on the 23rd morning. She was at the window of the music room, tuning before practice, when she saw Dmitri on the island's south path, speaking into a phone. This was not unusual. The men made calls. What was unusual was the specific quality of his awareness. The way he was turned slightly away from the house's main sightlines. The way his body language was not the body language of someone making a professional call. He finished the call and stood still for a moment, looking out at the lake. His expression, at this distance and in profile, was the expression of someone who had done a thing they cannot undone. She stood at the window and watched him, and felt a cold settle through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She found Nikolai in the operations wing, which was the first time she had ever come to find him there, rather than waiting for his evening visits. 2 of his men were present. He looked up from the table with a controlled surprise and the usual unguarding of his expression at the sight of her. "Can I speak to you?" she said. He said something in Russian to the others. They left. She told him what she'd seen. She did it without embellishment. The phone, the turned-away posture, the expression she'd seen on his face when the call ended. She watched Nikolai listen. His face was doing nothing. Absolute stillness, the kind that in anyone else would have looked blank, but on him meant he was moving very fast inside. "The expression," he said. "Describe it again." Like someone who had done something, she chose the word carefully, final, and was deciding whether to live with it. He looked at her for a long moment. "Stay here," he said. "Nikolai, Elena." His voice was very quiet. "This room is the safest place on the island. The door has a code," he showed her, pressing her hand to the keypad. "And if it changes to red, do not open it for anyone except Marta or me. Do you understand?" She looked at the keypad. "Yes." He put his hand against her face, the same gesture as always, the fingertips, the extraordinary care of it, and looked at her with an expression she would remember for a long time. 20 minutes, he said. "I will be back in 20 minutes. He was back in 18. He came back with a specific quality of control that told her the 18 minutes had not been peaceful. But he was intact, and when she reached for his hands, she found them steady. "Dmitri," he said. She nodded. "He is contained," he said. The word, delivered in that precise, quiet voice, was one of the most disturbing things she'd ever heard, and she decided not to ask what it meant in practice. "He has been communicating with Kessler's people for 3 weeks. In exchange for a pause. A position within Kessler's organization and a significant financial consideration. Does Kessler now know about the island?" "Yes." Nikolai looked at her with complete directness. "He knows the island and its coordinates, and, as of this morning, a significant portion of our defensive configuration." He paused. "He will come tonight." The word tonight sat between them. "How do you know tonight?" "Because Dmitri's last communication was this morning." He paused. "Because Kessler will want the element of surprise and will act on the freshest intelligence before we can respond to it. Because if I were Kessler, tonight is what I would choose." He paused again. "And because the Weather Service is predicting a storm beginning this afternoon, and Kessler has, historically, preferred weather cover for these operations." She looked at him. He was watching her with that dark, steady gaze, not reassuring her, not minimizing, not performing confidence, simply presenting the situation with the respect of someone who believed she could handle what was true. "What do we do?" she said. "We prepare," he said. "I am going to ask you to stay in the interior rooms, not as a concession, but as a tactical consideration. The men will be positioned on the perimeter. I will be—" He stopped, and something moved in his face. "I will be where I need to be." "Where you need to be is not here," she said. "No." "With me." He looked at her. "Elena." "I know," she said quickly. "I know. I'm not asking you to choose. I'm just—" She stopped. She pressed her hands flat on the table between them. "Come back. That's all I'm asking." He put both hands over hers. Large, certain hands. The hands that had broken a car window underwater and carried her out of a freezing lake. The hands that had held Chekhov and worked bread dough and touched her face with an impossibility of care. "Yes," he said. A single word, and he said it like a promise. She believed him. She had, she was aware, entirely run out of defenses against this man. The afternoon was a controlled undertaking. She did not see Nikolai again after he left the operations room, heard him, at intervals, through the house's stone corridors. The purposeful cadence of his movement, the low authority of his voice, giving orders in Russian and English both, the sound of doors and equipment and preparation. The island changed quality. Its peacetime atmosphere, the warm, contained quality she'd come to inhabit, contracted, replaced by a focused, kinetic alertness that reminded her of the moments before a performance began, when the hall was full and the lights went down and the air itself seemed to comprehend that something was about to happen. Marta came to her mid-afternoon with a bag. "You'll need this," she said, setting it on the bed. Inside, changes of clothes, a first aid kit, Elena's phone, charged now, connected to the island's secured network, a knife, small and wicked and folded, which Elena looked at and then looked at Marta. "You'll know if you need it," Marta said, with the complete equanimity of someone who had navigated worse. "Has this happened before?" Elena asked. "An attack on the island?" "Once," Marta said. 7 years ago. Different people, Different circumstances. She paused. We were fine. Nikolai, was he... He was shot, Marta said, without inflection. Twice. He was conducting a meeting 2 days later. She looked at Elena with those measuring eyes. He is, she searched, remarkable at the inconvenient times. You do not need to worry about him. I know, Elena said. I'm worrying about him anyway. Marta's expression shifted, something Elena had not seen before, a kind of careful assessment, as though she were verifying a hypothesis. He has not slept well in 12 years, Marta said, since I have worked here. He sleeps 4, 5 hours. He is awake. Sometimes I hear him in the house at 3, 4 in the morning. The kitchen, the library, the music room. She paused. For the last 10 days, I do not hear him in the night. Elena held her gaze. He is sleeping, Marta said simply. I do not know what to make of it except that she seemed to decide something. Whatever you are to him, it is large. Larger than he is accustomed to. She left. Elena sat with the bag on the bed and the knife on the table, and the gray afternoon light through the window, and the sound of the wind beginning, the storm arriving early, the lake speaking in its warning register, the sound she'd learned on the island to distinguish from its ordinary voice. Lower, more continuous, lacking the intervals of quiet that characterized its usual conversation with the shore. She picked up her violin. She played. Not for an audience, not for practice, not even, in any meaningful way, for herself. She played the way you say a prayer, or make a bargain, or simply insist, with the full capacity of her voice, standing in the middle of the room while the storm gathered outside and the island prepared for violence. Playing Brahms with every honest thing she had, which was considerable. One of Nikolai's men appeared in the doorway at some point. Young, serious-faced, one of the perimeter guards she recognized by sight. He stood there listening, with an expression she had never expected to see on a man in full tactical kit. Completely arrested, temporarily somewhere other than where his body was. She played until the light failed. Then she set down the violin, picked up the bag, and went to find the safest room, because that was what he'd asked of her, and she had decided. The night he'd made chamomile tea, and she'd met him in the kitchen at 3 a.m., that she would choose to trust this man, which meant trusting his judgment about the things that fell within his professional competence. The interior room he'd shown her was in the building's oldest section, stone-walled, with a single door and a small high window that looked onto the inner courtyard. It smelled of old wood and had 2 chairs and a lamp and a box of books and a thermos of coffee, Marta's preparation, she knew, and also, propped against the wall, her violin case. She sat in one of the chairs and opened the case and looked at the violin for a moment. The Guarneri, 300 years old, which had survived a car crash into a frozen lake and an apartment assault and a boat crossing at night and 17+ days on a private island. And then she closed the case. She was not going to play now. Now, she was going to sit in this room and be the music he had said she was, steady and patient in the dark, and she was going to trust that the man who'd woken from 4 years of broken sleep because of her was going to come back. Outside, the storm broke. They came by water, as Nikolai had predicted. She heard it before she understood it, not as sound, since the storm absorbed everything, but as a change in the quality of the stone itself, a vibration transmitted through the walls, the particular frequency of organized violence. Then she heard what the storm couldn't cover. The overlapping percussion of gunfire, close and then closer, and the lower, more percussive sound of larger weapons. She sat in the chair and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. 4 counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts out. The door code was illuminated green. She watched it. 20 minutes. The longest 20 minutes of her life, and she had lived through a car crash into a frozen lake, so she understood the competition. Then something she recognized above the storm, a different kind of sound. Not the organized percussion of a firefight, but the specific, proximate sound of someone moving through the corridor outside her door with the deliberate quietness of someone who did not want to be heard. Her pulse jumped. The door code turned red. She stood up. The knife was in her hand. She had taken it from the bag at some point, without consciously deciding to, and she pressed herself against the wall beside the door and breathed, and did not make a sound. "Miss Vance!" Not Nikolai's voice, accented differently, Eastern European, unsmoothed by years of American residence. "My name is Kessler. Open the door, please. No one has to be harmed." She said nothing. "Your protector is currently engaged elsewhere," Kessler said, through the door, almost conversationally, a man accustomed to having his reasonable requests respected. "He cannot come for you for some time. I suggest we resolve this efficiently. The recording you made, its deletion will end this immediately. You'll be returned to your life." She weighed this. She did not believe it exactly. Men who had cut brake lines and stormed apartments did not, as a general rule, let witnesses walk away. But she was aware that she was alone in a stone room with a small knife, and the door code was red, and she had limited options. She thought about what Nikolai had said. "I have never broken faith with a man who trusted me." She sat back down in the chair. "Miss Vance." "I hear you," she said. "Then open the door." "No," she said. A pause. That is, the first edge of something in the reasonable voice. Inadvisable. "Probably," she agreed. Another pause. She could hear him breathing. She could hear, beneath the storm, the firefight still going. Had not stopped, she noted. Which meant Nikolai's men were holding. Which meant Nikolai was still operational. "The recording is on your phone," Kessler said. "I can verify this. Give me the phone, and you're done." She looked at her phone on the chair's armrest. The recording was on it. It was also, Malo had informed her through the intermediary, on secure federal servers that had had copies since the morning after Elena's hospital discharge. The phone was a variable, not the whole picture. "The recording is in multiple locations," she said. Silence on the other side. "You're a musician," Kessler said after a moment, not a question. "Not someone accustomed to this. Let me offer you something straightforward." His voice had changed, something more sincere in it, which she found, paradoxically, more frightening than the reasonable negotiating tone. "Volkov is a temporary solution. He cannot protect you indefinitely. I can make this permanent. Your silence in exchange for your freedom and a sum of money that would allow you to play music for the rest of your life without financial consideration." She thought about what he was offering. Freedom, music, safety. Everything she had claimed to want before the lake, before the island, before a man with Chekhov and warm tea and the most careful hands she had ever encountered. "How large a sum?" she said. A pause, a recalculating one, she could hear it. He thought she was considering it. "Name a figure," he said. She picked up her phone. She opened the recording application. "I'd need time to think about it," she said. "Of course," Kessler said, and the reasonableness was back, full strength. "Take the time you need." She pressed record. She set the phone against the crack at the bottom of the door. There was a half-inch gap, old house, uneven settling, and she angled it upward, toward the voice, and she began to speak. She talked for 11 minutes. She asked him about the shipment. He spoke about it, in the manner of a man closing a negotiation, confirming details that she already knew and adding several she did not. She asked about the man he'd placed inside Nikolai's organization. He was careful here, but not careful enough. She had been trained to hear what was behind the notes as much as the notes themselves. She kept her voice even and her questions natural, and her hand pressed to the phone on the floor. When the door behind Kessler was opened and his voice stopped, mid-sentence, she did not hear it over the storm. But she heard him stop speaking, and she heard something else. And then she heard Nikolai's voice, very quiet, saying something in Russian that she caught only the first word of. Enough. She picked up the phone. She pressed stop. The door code turned green. She found him in the inner courtyard. He was standing in the storm, the rain horizontal, the wind at a pitch that made conversation nearly impossible. And there were two men with him who she did not know, and Kessler was on his knees in the rain with his hands secured behind him, and Nikolai's shirt was dark across the left shoulder in a way that was not rain. She was across the courtyard and at his side before she had consciously moved. "You're shot," she said. "It's... Do not say fine," she said.
"I will accept many things from you, but I will not accept fine." Something crossed his face. That ghost of something that was, she now knew, the expression he made when she surprised him. "Through and through," he said. "Clean. Not the first time, as Marta has informed you." He paused. "You're not supposed to be out here." The door code was green. She reached for the left side of his shirt. He didn't stop her, and she could feel the wetness through the fabric, the specific warmth of blood that was not the rain's temperature. "This needs to be seen to." "Shortly." He looked at her with that focused, specific attention. I'm fine," she said, with deliberate irony. His mouth moved. The ghost became something more concrete. It was, unmistakably, a smile. Small, controlled, his, but present. "The courtyard is clear," he said, to the men behind him. Something in Russian. She caught interior, confirmed, perimeter, before she lost the thread, and the men moved with efficiency, taking Kessler with them. Nikolai watched them go, with the expression of a man finalizing an account. "Your men?" she asked. "Two injured, neither critically." A pause. "Dmitri is..." Another pause. "Contained, as I said." She nodded. She did not ask further. "Kessler's team was 8 people. We have resolved that." The word resolved again. She was learning his vocabulary. It contained large, dark rooms she chose not to enter. What she knew was that she was standing in a storm, in a courtyard, with a man who had just fought for her life, again, and that the shoulder wound was still bleeding, and he was standing in the rain as though he were unaware of the concept of shelter. "Inside," she said. "Inside," she said, and took his uninjured arm and walked him toward the house. And he came. This, too, she had learned about him, that he could be moved by the right authority, and that she was, apparently, in possession of it. Marta had the first aid room already prepared. She dealt with Nikolai's shoulder with the efficient, experienced dexterity of someone who had done this before, and Elena stood and held the materials Marta asked for, and watched Nikolai submit to the treatment with the controlled patience of a man for whom this was simply another operational variable, which she found both impressive and upsetting in equal measure. "The recording," Elena said when Marta had finished. Nikolai looked at her. "The second one," she said. "From tonight, Kessler through the door." She held up her phone. He confirmed the shipment details, the date, the dock, the contact name, everything Marlowe needs for a federal warrant. She paused. "And he spoke enough about Dmitri's arrangement to corroborate what you found." Nikolai looked at her phone, then at her. The look on his face was... She would need a new word for it, eventually. There were not enough existing words. "You did that deliberately," he said. "Yes." "While he was on the other side of the door." "Yes." "Alone." "I was not alone," she said. "You were coming back. I had faith in that." He looked at her for a long moment. "You have," he said slowly, "a very particular quality of courage." "Musician's courage," she said. "You commit to the note before you know if it's going to resolve." He reached out with his uninjured arm and put his hand over hers where she held the phone, and she pressed her hand up against his, and they stayed like that for a moment, her hand in his, the phone warm between them with its 11 minutes of evidence. "It's over," he said. "Yes," she said. Neither of them moved.
Elena, not tonight, she said. Whatever needs to be said, not tonight. Tonight we've earned a night without it. He looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. Yes, we have. She did not sleep until dawn. Not from fear. The fear, to her own considerable surprise, had resolved with the gunfire, had been replaced by a quieter, more enduring thing that had no particular urgency. She didn't sleep because she didn't want to. She sat in the kitchen with the fire banked and a cup of tea gone cold and the gray pre-dawn light beginning in the east windows, and she thought about everything the way you think after a crisis. Not in organized sequence, but in fragments, images, the particular sensory inventory of the previous 12 hours. The red door code, Kessler's reasonable voice, the smell of rain and gunpowder in the courtyard, the feel of his blood through wet fabric. She thought about Marlowe. She had sent the recording already, through the island's secure channel to the intermediary, with a voice message explaining the context, asking for confirmation of receipt. The confirmation had come back within 40 minutes. Federal warrants in motion. Kessler's shipment would not reach its buyers. The dock would be covered. She thought about her apartment on Wrightwood Avenue, the bergamot candle, probably exhausted by now, and the unfinished coffee that had been sitting on the counter for 3 weeks. Her students, the recital she was meant to give in February, the ordinary machinery of her ordinary life, waiting at a distance. She thought about Nikolai. She heard him before he appeared. She always heard him now, had learned the register of his footsteps, coming through the hall with the slight adjustment in gait that told her the shoulder was bothering him more than he would admit. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Tea's cold," she said. "I can make more." He came in, moved to the kettle with the slightly careful movement of his left side, and she watched him fill it and set it on the burner with the ordinary competence of a man who had done this 10,000 times in this kitchen. He sat down across from her. The morning light was coming in now, gray gold, the storm entirely past, the lake outside the windows smooth and improbably beautiful in the way of bodies of water after violence, as though they have no memory. "What happens now?" she asked. "With Kessler in federal custody and the shipment intercepted," he paused. "The immediate threat is removed. You can return to the city. Your life." He said it as though reading from a prepared statement, with the controlled neutrality of a man who had rehearsed this. She looked at him. "Is that what you want?" He looked at his hands on the table. "What I want," he said, very quietly, "is not a question I have historically permitted myself to weight heavily. It has not been productive. I'm asking you to weight it heavily now," she said. He looked at her. In the morning light, without the fire's warmth, and in the gray clarity of the dawn, she could see him clearly. The angular face, the broken and reset nose, the dark eyes, the scar at the corner of his jaw she'd noticed weeks ago and never asked about. And she could see, underneath all of it, the things she'd been seeing since the library and the picture book and the night in the kitchen at 3 a.m. A man who had survived a great deal and learned from all of it, and was, in this moment, holding something carefully in both hands and not sure if he was allowed to keep it. "I want you to stay," he said. She breathed. "Not here, permanently," he said, carefully. "I am aware that I cannot ask you to live an island life in indefinite operational security. I am aware that you have a world, a career, a life that doesn't accommodate—" a pause. "A man like me." "A man like you," she repeated. "And what kind of man is that, specifically?" He met her eyes. "Dangerous, compromised, in possession of a professional life that is not going to become something else simply because—" He stopped. "Because?" she prompted. He looked at her with that unguarded expression, fully unguarded now, in the gray morning light. "Because I have fallen in love with a violinist," he said, "who played Sibelius so honestly that I could not subsequently look away from anything that concerned her. The silence was complete. She reached across the table and put both her hands over both of his. "I'm not asking you to become something else," she said. "I'm asking you to stay what you are and let me stay who I am and find out what those two things look like together." She paused. "That's all. That's the whole ask." He looked at their hands on the table. "You understand what I am," he said. "Yes," she said. "I told you. I know what you are." "Elena, Nikolai." She waited until he looked at her. "I committed to the note before I knew if it would resolve. That's what I do. That's the courage of it." She looked at him steadily. "I believe it will resolve." He turned his hands under hers so that they were holding each other, both hands, both of his, both of hers, and he looked at her across the kitchen table in the pale Chicago winter morning with an expression she finally had a word for. Home, she thought. He is looking at me the way people look at home. "Yes," he said. The kettle began to sound. Neither of them moved. The federal agents arrived at the island on the second morning following the assault. Not for Nikolai. This was the part Elena had spent 2 days trying to understand, the labyrinthine logic of a system in which the most dangerous man in Chicago sat across a kitchen table from 2 FBI agents and drank coffee and answered questions with the cooperative affect of a man who had thought carefully about what to say and had said exactly that and nothing more. Marlowe was there too, gray-bunned and sharp, watching the proceedings with the careful attention of someone maintaining an accurate score. The agents wanted the recording. Elena gave it to them, both of them, the original from the theater and the one from behind the door. And she told the story of both with the precision she brought to everything she considered important. And the agents wrote it down and asked follow-up questions and treated her with the careful respect of people handling something they found delicate. Kessler was in federal custody. The dock operation had been intercepted in the pre-dawn hours following his arrest. 4 other members of his organization were in custody. The shipment was in federal evidence storage. The chain was broken. Her name would be in the record. There was no way around this. She was the witness. She was the recording. She was the person whose existence had initiated a federal investigation into an Eastern European arms trafficking operation. She would need to speak with federal prosecutors. She would need to be available for proceedings that might take months. She accepted this with the pragmatism of a woman who had decided that the truth was worth more than convenience. After the agents left, she and Marlowe sat alone in the library. "You're going home," Marlowe said. It was not a question. "Yes," Elena said, and Marlowe gestured, carefully, at the house around them. Elena looked at her. "I don't believe that's investigatively relevant, Detective." Marlowe's mouth moved in something that was, technically, a smile. "No," she agreed. "I don't suppose it is." She looked at the shelves. "He has extraordinary taste in music." "Yes," Elena said. "He does." Marlowe looked at her steadily. "Be careful," she said. "Everyone keeps saying that to me," Elena said. "I've decided it's not the relevant instruction." Marlowe looked at her for a long moment. "What's the relevant instruction?" Elena thought about part and the incomplete half, the melody reaching for the sound that should be there. "Pay attention," she said. Marlowe nodded once, slowly, like a woman filing something away for later. Nikolai drove her back to the mainland himself. Not the young driver with the shaved head, himself, in a large dark car that moved smoothly through the winter morning, the city assembling itself gradually through the windshield as they drove north toward Lincoln Park. He had spent the morning in the operations wing, and she hadn't pushed to know what had happened there. She knew the broad strokes. Reorganization following the Dmitri situation, adjustments to the operation's security protocols, 2 men transferred and 1 dismissed. The machinery of what he ran, continuing to run. "Marta will send your things," he said. "I know." "The granary, I have it." It was in the back seat, the case intact. The city got denser. She could see the park through the left windows, still snow-covered, the trees bare and black against the white. "February," she said. He glanced at her. "The recital," she said. "It was postponed, obviously. They'll reschedule for February. It's at Symphony Center." She looked at him steadily. "There are VIP seats." A pause. "I am aware of the location. And presumably the mechanism for obtaining tickets." Another pause. His mouth moved. "Yes," he said. "Come," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That is..." A pause. "A significant public visibility for both of us." "Yes," she said, "it is. Come anyway." He drove. The park went by. The familiar streets of Lincoln Park assembled around the car. "I will be in the VIP section," he said, "when you play Sibelius." She looked at him and felt something large and warm, and specifically his move, through her. "I know," she said. He pulled to the curb on Wrightwood Avenue. Her building, the brick face familiar and ordinary, a new police vehicle outside. Marlowe had arranged continued protection for another week, formality rather than necessity. Her life, waiting. She did not immediately get out of the car. Neither did he. "Nikolai," she said. He turned. She leaned across the center console and kissed him, slowly, with intention, with everything that the 17 days and the music and the 3 a.m. kitchen and the red door code and the courtyard in the rain had accumulated into. And he kissed her back with the same quality of complete attention he brought to everything, his hand against her jaw, his thumb at her cheekbone, the most careful possible contact. "February," she said against his mouth. "February," he said. She got out of the car. She picked up the violin case from the back seat. She walked to her building door without looking back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she understood, in the way that musicians understand timing, with an instinct for when the phrase needs space, that this particular moment required her to go first. She heard the car behind her, still there. He was watching her go. She pressed the code for the front door and went in. Upstairs, her apartment was undisturbed, mostly. Someone had cleaned up the shattered window, boarded the frame. Her coffee cup was still on the table. The bergamot candle, as she'd suspected, had burned down to nothing in its jar. She set the Guarneri case on the table, sat down, and put her face in her hands and breathed. Then she picked up her phone and called her manager and told him February. December became January. The city was the same. Same gray water, same wind, same relentless light and dark cycle of a northern winter. And she was the same, outwardly. The Lincoln Park apartment, the Tuesday lessons, the practice hours that structured her days like the beams of a building. The recital rehearsals began. She worked with the orchestra's music director on the Sibelius cadenza, a passage she had played hundreds of times and was now hearing differently. The extended solo section, the violin alone above the orchestra, the note that contained everything, with a new quality of understanding that she was not entirely certain she could have articulated, but that came out in the playing in ways that the music director noticed without being able to explain. "What happened to you?" he asked after a particularly intense rehearsal, not unkindly. "I had an experience," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Keep it," he said. "Whatever it was. Keep it." She kept it. Nikolai called on Wednesdays. This had established itself without discussion. Wednesday evening, 8 o'clock. A call that lasted an hour or sometimes 2, during which they talked about music and books and the specific texture of their days with the intimacy of people who had already moved past the stage of presenting themselves favorably and were simply being actual. He had been reading. She could tell from the calls. The Chekhov letters had given way to a biography of Shostakovich, which had given way to a collection of essays on perception in music that she had recommended, and which he had apparently acquired and consumed in a week. "He argues that we don't hear music," Nikolai said on the second Wednesday. "We construct it. That the sound waves are neutral data, and the experience is entirely generated by the listener. He's right, she said. That is disturbing. Why? Because it suggests that what I heard when you played Sibelius was entirely mine, a thing I made from my own material. She thought about this. That's not disturbing, she said. That's the point. The music is a space for the listener to put themselves. The composer gives you the architecture. What you furnish it with is yours. A pause. What did you hear when you played it? She thought. Fear, she said, and the decision to go forward anyway. Sibelius was terrified of failure. He stopped composing for the last 30 years of his life because he was afraid the next thing wouldn't be worthy of the previous things. She paused. I understood that, and I decided, in that specific performance, in that hall, to play as though the fear was the music, not the obstacle to it. A long silence. Yes, he said. That is what I heard. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass, cold, the city's winter pressing in from outside, and felt him 3 hours away on the phone, and also somehow entirely present. He came to the city twice in January. Both times he stayed at a hotel in the Gold Coast that was the kind of hotel she did not generally have occasion to visit. Discreet, significant, the kind of place that had strong opinions about what was visible and what was not. She met him there. They did not go to restaurants. They ordered room service and ate at the table by the window with the city below them, the lake always visible, the water that had tried to take her and that had given her the lighter and the scarf and whatever followed. And they talked and listened to records on a portable player he'd brought. And the city's winter light moved around the room in the slow arc of short days. She showed him how to hold a bow. Standing behind her, his hand over hers, the formal bow-hold position, she showed him where the fingers go, the specific relationship between the index finger and the stick, the contact points. He was imperfect, deeply imperfect, his fingers too accustomed to other purposes. But he understood the theory precisely, and he was patient with himself in a way she hadn't expected, without the pride that makes learning difficult. You're not competitive with yourself, she observed. I am extremely competitive with myself, he said, from directly behind her, his breath against her temple. But I have learned that competition with an absolute standard is pointless. You compete with what is possible for you. That is, she said, a healthy attitude. I arrived at it late, he said. It cost significant things to learn. She turned and looked at him at close range. The hotel light was warmer than island light, more revealing in some ways, softer in others, and she could see the particular planes of his face with a clarity she found she was glad of. What does this look like? She asked. Going forward, practically. He held her gaze. I am not a man who can give you simple, he said. I cannot offer Tuesday violin lessons and clean normality, and I know, she said. There will be times when I cannot explain where I am or what I am doing, he said. There will be complications, risks, a life that is not ordinary. I know, she said again. I have been thinking about this, and what I have concluded is, she paused, ordinary was never what I wanted. I wanted a life that meant something, that had weight. She looked at him steadily. You are not comfortable. You are not safe. You are not the life I planned. A pause. You are, inexplicably, the life that feels most real. And I am a musician who understands that the notes you don't plan are often the ones that make the piece. He looked at her for a long moment. I will try, he said, to be worthy of that. You already are, she said. Symphony Center was full. She stood in the wings and listened to the hall fill, that particular sound of 2,000 people finding their seats, the collective acoustic settling of a full room, the cough and murmur and program rustle that preceded silence. and she felt the familiar adrenaline of preparation, the body's truthful response to the fact that she was about to do the most exposed thing a human being could do: stand alone in front of 2,000 people and tell the truth. Her bow hand was steady. The music director was speaking with the first violin section. The oboe played its A for tuning. She heard the orchestra settle onto the note and the hall quiet in response to it, that Pavlovian hush. And she closed her eyes and let the note ring through her. She had played the Sibelius 17 times in her career. She had played it in Berlin and Amsterdam and Cleveland and Boston. She had played it after the wrist fracture and after her professor's death, and after a period 2 years ago when she had nearly stopped performing entirely, frightened by a quality of emptiness she couldn't explain. She had played it in every mood and condition. She had never played it for someone specifically. She had never wanted to. She found the VIP section from the wings, which required a specific angle and the lighting to cooperate, and it did. She found him. 4th row, end seat. The position chosen with the instinct of a man who seated himself with exits in view. Dark suit. Still. Already watching the stage with those dark eyes, though she had not yet appeared. She put her hand over her heart once, briefly, a gesture no one saw. She walked out onto the stage. The applause was immediate, warm, the particular welcome of a Chicago audience for one of its own, and she acknowledged it with the bow she'd learned to give at 7, unhurried, genuine, a full conversation with the room. And then she turned and nodded to the conductor and raised her bow. The opening bars of the Sibelius Violin Concerto are among the most exposed in the repertoire. The violin alone, no preamble, no orchestral support, beginning in the low register and ascending, a voice emerging from nothing, finding itself, discovering its range. She played this passage now with everything she had, which was everything the previous months had given her. The lake and the island and the music room and the early mornings and the 3 a.m. chamomile tea and the feeling of his hands over hers and the red door code and the courtyard in the rain. She played fear as music, as she'd told him. She played the decision to go forward. She played the note that contained everything. In the 4th row, at the end of the aisle, she could feel, though she could not see, was playing, with her eyes forward, in the middle distance where performers live, the quality of his attention, the complete stillness, the listening. This is what I know you as, she thought, her bow moving through the cadenza's opening passage, the most exposed moment in the piece, the violin unaccompanied, the orchestra silent. This is what I know you as, the person who listens with everything. The cadenza was 7 minutes long. She played it as though 7 minutes were all the time that had ever existed. Afterward, the reception, the hands shaken and the praise received, and the journalist from the Tribune who asked her about the recording and the federal case, and she gave him nothing except her professional smile. She found him in the lobby, standing precisely where she'd expected, apart, watching, holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. She stopped in front of him. "Well," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was fully open, fully his, not a performance. The expression he kept for her, that had no other recipient. "The cadenza," he said. "The unaccompanied passage. You changed something." "Yes," she said. "The tempo. In the 3rd phrase." She paused. "I slowed it down." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I was playing it for someone who listens slowly," she said. "Who takes the time." The lobby moved around them. People, champagne, the ordinary noise of a successful performance, and none of it reached them. "Elena," he said. "I know," she said. He put out his hand, the one that had broken car windows underwater and made bread and held Chekhov and touched her face with impossible care, and she put hers into it. They walked out of Symphony Center into the February night,
the lake visible at the end of the street, the air cold and clear, the sky above the city with its reflected orange glow, and she thought about Part's incomplete piece, the violin reaching for the piano that wasn't there, and the way it had sounded in the island house when the silence became, somehow, full. She thought about the third key, the one that was neither original nor predicted. "Where are we going?" she asked. He looked at her. The ghost that was no longer a ghost. It was a smile now, fully present, fully his, the rarest thing she had ever seen. "Somewhere," he said. "That's not specific enough," she said. "No," he agreed, "but we're going there together." She tightened her hand in his, and they walked toward the city's light, and behind them, the lake did what it always did, patient, enormous, indifferent to everything except its own vast conversation with the shore, and the violin case over her shoulder contained 300 years of accumulated resonance, and ahead of them, the night had the quality of a phrase that had not yet been written. Which was, she decided, exactly right. Spring came to Chicago the way it always came, reluctant, provisional, arriving in increments that could be revoked without notice. She was in the music room when she heard it for the first time, the moment the city decided to become a different season, when the wind off the lake shifted from north to southwest, and the temperature crossed some invisible threshold, and outside the window the park turned, overnight, from gray to tentatively green. She was playing the Brahms, the sonata she had played alone so many times, the one she now played differently, because she now had a different understanding of what Brahms had been doing with those 45 minutes, of what it meant to write music for something you had no other language for. She was playing the second movement, the adagio, slow and interior and searching, when the door opened. Nikolai came in and sat in his chair. He was in Chicago more often now. This had established itself in the same organic way that the Wednesday calls had established themselves, without announcement, without negotiation, simply as the natural expression of a gravity that both of them had stopped pretending was theoretical. He came for 3 days, sometimes 4. He returned to the island or to the other places his work required him, and she returned to her practice and her students and her recitals and her ordinary life, which was what it was, and also significantly more than it had been. The apartment had his coat in the closet. She had a key to a place she had been to twice that was not the island, a penthouse in the Gold Coast that she suspected was the kind of address that appeared in Tribune stories with words like "alleged" near it, and that had a turntable and a record collection that she was steadily adding to. Marta sent her recipes. On evenings when he was in the city, they ate at the kitchen table and talked and listened to music and argued about books. He had developed a theory about Tolstoy that she found both brilliant and slightly unhinged. She had developed an opinion about early Chicago jazz that she was going to play him through comprehensively, whether he liked it or not. He had been to 3 of her performances in 6 weeks. She was learning, slowly, in available dimensions, what his days actually contained, which was more complicated and darker than she had hoped, and which she was dealing with by reading more than she had before, and asking questions, and accepting incomplete answers, and choosing, deliberately, to stay. There were things she did not ask. She had made her peace with this. She was not naive, and she was not, she had decided, a woman who could only love something uncomplicated. She loved the thing he actually was, not the thing she'd wanted him to be, not the sanitized version, not the exception she told herself he was. She loved the actual thing. He had started to tell her more than she asked for. This had taken time, the particular carefulness of a man who had spent his life exercising total control over what was shared and with whom. But it was happening, incrementally, in the way that glaciers move, too slowly to observe directly, but with effects that were undeniable. She had learned his tells. The slight tension at the corner of his mouth when something he'd said was less than complete.
The quality of his silences. He had many different silences, and she could read most of them now. The way he looked at her when she played. She could feel this without seeing it. A specific quality of attention that she had come to understand was a form of disclosure. He was, she had concluded, a man for whom music was the language that said what other language couldn't.
This was not, as it happened, the worst thing to have in common with a person. Now she played the Brahms Adagio to its end, the long descending phrase, the return to the tonic, and lowered the bow and turned. He was looking at her with the open expression, the one that had no other recipient. "I have something for you," he said. He set something on the music room table. A record sleeve. She came closer to look. Vintage, late 60s pressing, slightly worn at the corners with the patina of genuine use. She looked at the label. Arvo Part, Spiegel im Spiegel, the original recording. She looked at him. "Marta found it," he said, "in a collection I acquired some years ago in Odessa. I didn't know it was there until I was..." A pause. Looking. She picked it up and turned it over, and felt the weight of it, the record inside, the weight of the vinyl and the paper and the decades. And she looked at him with the specific feeling that occupied her chest whenever something he did was so wholly him that she had no distance from it. "This is the complete piece," she said. "Yes," he said. "Piano and violin both?" "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I thought, perhaps, the music room has adequate acoustics for both instruments." A pause. "There is a piano in the East Wing that Marta says has been tuned recently." She looked at him. "I told you," he said, "that my hands are wrong for it. This is true. I have been..." A pause. "Practicing. In the early mornings, when you are asleep." He held her gaze without looking away. "I am not good. I am functional. The Spiegel piano part is within range." She put the record down. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and put both her hands against his face, her musician's hands, calloused and precise, and looked at him with everything she had. "You have been getting up at 5 in the morning," she said, "to practice piano." "Yes." "So that you could play the missing part." "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, at this improbable man, this dangerous, impossible, wholly real man who had pulled her out of a frozen lake and saved her life, and given her his coat, and made chamomile tea, and read picture books for a child's literacy, and worked bread dough in a storm, and sat in a chair, and listened with everything he had, and decided, somewhere in the early mornings, to get up and practice the piano. "Nikolai," she said. "Yes?" "I love you," she said. The silence was complete. His eyes were entirely open. The ghost of everything was gone, replaced by the full thing, present and uncovered. The expression of a man who had been given something enormous and was holding it with both hands. "Elena," he said, very quietly. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said. I have been..." He stopped. She watched him navigate the grammar of it, the language he was learning. "I have been in love with you since you woke up on the shore of Lake Michigan, and your first thought was for a violin. And I have been insufficiently equipped to say so until now." She kissed him, long and unhurried, the way the sonata's slow movement is unhurried, with the understanding that time is not, in certain moments, a limited resource. "The piano is in the East Wing," she said when they separated. "Yes," he said. She picked up her bow. "Play it with me," she said. "The incomplete piece. Let's make it complete." He looked at her for a moment. Dark eyes, open face, the man who had chosen to exist in a third key with her, and who woke at 5 in the morning to learn the thing she needed him to know. "Yes," he said. They walked through the house together, her violin in one hand and his in the other,
toward the east wing and the piano and the music that had been waiting to be whole. Outside the window, Chicago in its first tentative spring, the park greening, the lake quieting, the city going on as it always went on, vast and indifferent, and full of ordinary violence and ordinary grace, did what it did. And inside the house, a woman who heard the shape of silence, and a man who had learned to let it speak, played Spiegel im Spiegel for the first time, with both its voices, the mirror finding its reflection at last, the incomplete thing becoming complete. The music rose, the mirror answered, the dark symphony at long last resolved.